Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Recently Read. This week I'm going to be reviewing Manhunt, the 10-year search for bin Laden from 9/11 to Abbottabad by Peter L. Bergen. This book was published in 2013 and it details the capture or the actual eventual discovery of Osama bin Laden. This book covers a period of time, quite a broad period of time, going from the 80s, 90s, into the aughts, until the point where Osama bin Laden was killed by a special ops force in Pakistan. The book details information about bin Laden, his rise to power, some background information of his organization, his terrorist organization, Al Qaeda. It details information about his sort of plans of attack against the U.S. He seems to be a person who was very singularly focused on the U.S. The lead up to 9/11, the intelligence failures leading up to 9/11, as well as the administrative failures of the government in the U.S. at the time. For instance, George W. Bush or George Bush Jr., who was president at the time that the 9/11 attacks took place. So the book is sort of divided into three parts. The first part is the lead up to 9/11. The second part is everything that kind of happened afterwards, including the CIA search and the intelligence efforts to find and capture Osama bin Laden. And the last bit is what happened just afterwards. It's the shortest bit. It's essentially the sort of maybe political firestorm that happened afterwards, or when the U.S. Went in and killed bin Laden. It did so without Pakistani permission, and some of those aspects are discussed. Pakistan, of course, was not very happy with the way it occurred. Also, many people in the Muslim world were unhappy with the handling of bin Laden's body in the wake of his death. And so some of those details are covered in this book. It's a very interesting book. It's in some ways quite dated. Well, it's relatively dated. It came out in 2013. And so this is a few years after after the operation that found and eliminated bin Laden. And so in many ways, it is definitely a book of its time. It's not really a history in the sense that history books sort of try to gather all the information that they can, and then they present that information very much kind of from a historical perspective. In some ways, Manhunt is a little bit history, but it's very recent history. It's also journalism. So it's very much written from the perspective of the time that it was written. So that may seem obvious, but it's sort of more journalism than history. The information that Bergen was working with is very much of the time. It's what's made available to him. For instance, the people who were involved in the operation were not exactly known. There were still many aspects that were classified. There's still aspects that are classified, so there's a lot of information that it's still not available for various reasons. But a lot of the information was sort of fresh. It was, at the time, still much closer to the events of 9/11. Essentially, you're looking at a period of time of 10 years. Now, that may seem like a long time, but in terms of historical terms, it's not. In terms of journalistic in terms, it is. But in terms of historical analyses, it's actually not a long time. Oftentimes, history books will take a sort of longue durée look at the events that they covered. This isn't quite that. It's very much of its time. The attacks on 9/11 were during 9/11 in the U.S. were very much is still fresh in people's memories. Now, if for whatever reason you're not aware of that, of what happened, if you're sort of born in the post 9/11 world, just a quick recap: 9/11 refers to September 9th, 2001. So 9/11. I'm sorry, did I say September 9th? No, September 11th, 2001, in which two planes flew into the World Trade Center that were referred to colloquially as the Twin Towers. They were hijacked. These were cross-country domestic flights in the U.S. that were hijacked by members of the Al-Qaeda terrorist group and were flown into the World Trade Center. Another plane was flown into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and another plane was crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. At the time that this occurred, I remember I was working in Midtown Manhattan in New York, and I was working at a building on 50th Street, the Time Warner, what was called the Time Warner building. I don't know if it's still called that today. But I remember going down, or actually going up, I can't quite remember. I remember getting off the elevator at work and seeing the IT guy saying, another plane flew into the Twin Towers. This must be a mistake. And I thought, what? Now, I had gotten to work kind of late because I was coming in from Queens and trains were delayed, but they were still running, but they were really heavily delayed. And it took a long time for me to get into Manhattan where I was working. And then I remember I ran into my office and I turned on the radio and immediately heard people talking about, actually turned on Howard Stern, and he was talking about, that this was a terrorist attack, that it's like a movie. This can't be real. It was still sort of happening in real time, and people were sort of confused. And I remember going to this terrace that we had in our building, in the Time Warner building, and looking at the building. You could see the buildings, and I had this camera with a really strong focus, but I had no film, so I actually couldn't shoot. I didn't have any film in the camera, but I could sort of focus. So I could focus my camera and zoom in fairly close to the World Trade Center because I could actually see the buildings and I could see the smoke coming out of the building. And I was like, wow, this is crazy. And I remember thinking, oh, well, they can repair that, right? They can repair that. And then I remember there were some construction workers who were doing some work in the building. And I remember one of the guys saying, oh my God, there are people dying in there right now. Now, we were too far away to see people jumping from the building. I didn't see that until later. I saw that on TV. But I remember being like, oh my God, that's true. And I remember looking around and seeing, well, first of all, there were some reports that maybe there were other buildings that were being hijacked. And I remember looking around and seeing Radio City Music Hall that was relatively nearby, and realizing that I was in a very sort of touristy area, and realizing like I'm in a targeted area. If they're targeting these buildings, or they're targeting this area that can be attacked, I need to get out of here. And so I left, and by this point the trains were no longer really working. The trains weren't working. And I remember walking through the streets, and people were crying because they were so shocked. And I imagine people knew people in those buildings. In fact, I had an account that I was working with. So I was working for a publisher as a sales rep, and I had an account in the World Trade Center. I never heard from them again. I don't know what happened to that store. I imagine that it just, went out of business for sure, obviously. The building was totally destroyed. Anyway, so I remember trying to call my girlfriend at the time and trying to meet up with her, and making my way to my old high school, and cell phones really weren't working, and it was a beautiful day. And then we walked all the way up to my mother's house in the upper part of Manhattan, and just walked across the city through Central Park and up the city, just kind of being in shock at what happened. So this was a massive event. It was the first attack on U.S. soil since Pearl Harbor. But really, when you think about it, it was also the first attack of this scale on U.S. soil in sort of the U.S., the sort of the big country, because of course Pearl Harbor is in Hawaii. So I kind of see that as being a little bit separated. It's not in the mainland, and it was an unbelievable event. What happened afterwards was the U.S. invaded Afghanistan, and then soon after also invaded Iraq, and shockingly, and I remember thinking this was shocking, did not capture Osama bin Laden. The focus from Afghanistan and the capture of bin Laden to then sort of focusing on building a case against Iraq, based on this notion that they had weapons of mass destruction. I remember even then that it was a major diversion. And I remember thinking, well, they didn't capture him, and so they want us to forget. And it was effective. People forgot. There was this big sort of focus on going after Iraq that was pushed by people like Paul Wolfowitz and Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, which was in some ways, at the time, it felt like, well, they didn't finish the job from Bush Sr.'s presidency in the early 90s. And so this is an opportunity to do that, while at the same time making people forget that there was this person, Osama bin Laden, who had masterminded this massive attack on U.S. soil. One of the interesting things about this book is that it mentions that, but it doesn't really focus on it enough. So there seems to have been a diversion of resources away from Afghanistan and away from trying to capture bin Laden into trying to topple Iraq and then rebuild Iraq, which is a very complex story, and I won't cover it here. It's something that I may review or talk about in a future video. But this book doesn't spend a whole lot of time talking about it. It focuses more on the intelligence, the CIA efforts to try to capture Osama bin Laden, what was going on both in Washington and in the field. And when I say the field, I mean in the Middle East. So CIA agents working in countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, the intelligence efforts going on in those countries in order to try to capture Osama bin Laden, and also some of the people, the senior officials in Al-Qaeda, and less so on some of the things that maybe led to the failings or the sort of lack of resources towards that, which were being siphoned towards the war effort in Iraq. One of the things that comes out of this book that I think is really interesting was just how effective Obama was. Now, Barack Obama, who was the president at the time that Osama bin Laden was captured, was not involved whatsoever during the previous 20 years, actually even more than that, while Al-Qaeda was on the rise. Much more of that sort of falls a little bit on Reagan to a certain degree. A lot of it falls on Bill Clinton, because, and I say it falls on, because it's not to say that Bill Clinton's administration necessarily failed at their work regarding Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda. In fact, it was during their time that Al Qaeda began to sort of to rise and to form, and Osama bin Laden was this sort of like stateless Islamic sheikh or leader, if you will, who was sort of bouncing around from place to place. He spent some time in different countries. His family's from Saudi Arabia, but he spent time where he was in Afghanistan. He spent time in some other places. He spent time in Sudan. I believe it's Sudan. Maybe Uganda. I'm not 100% sure. So spent some time in some African Muslim majority African nations, sort of building his network. And before he finally landed in Afghanistan, where he found a government that was somewhat ideologically in agreement with his own personal views, religious views, governmental views, which is, again, as I've mentioned in other videos, which is a government based on Quranic law or Sharia law. And so a lot of that occurred during Bill Clinton's time. By the time Bill Clinton left and Bush came in, this was becoming a big issue. Now, one of the things that the book talks about is that there were some intelligence failures, as I mentioned already. There were letters written by CIA intelligence officers, essentially detailing and giving warnings, providing warnings about these attacks, and they were largely ignored. Now, I remember this was something that was being talked about in some circles, but it seemed like it wasn't really getting through to certain people, that there was a massive failure by the Bush administration in that they weren't really paying attention. At the time that the attacks occurred, George Bush had just come off of what had been one of the sort of longest presidential vacations. And I remember even then, at the time, being aware of the fact that this was a president who had spent a lot of time on, vacation. So, I'm sure some people might dispute this, but this seemed to be what was going on. And these attacks happened on his watch. Now, the book kind of covers some of that, but it sort of skates over it. And then comes to the point where the 10 years in the wake of the attacks and the intelligence gathering that occurred during that period of time, leading into Barack Obama's presidency. Now, Barack Obama is an interesting figure because he had only been in government for 2 years at the time that, when I say in government, I think he was in Congress for 2 years. And then he sort of rose up to becoming president very quickly on the heels of a galvanizing speech that he gave during the Democratic convention of 2004, I believe it is, when John Kerry was running for president. And he sort of became this rising figure. He really comes off really well in this book, in some ways. It depends on your perspective. Now, I'm not sure if Peter Bergen is particularly biased or partial towards Obama as a president. And that's one of the things you have to be careful with these books, is that when you read them, there is sometimes some political bias that might lead to either blind spots, especially regarding presidents and other governmental figures in the U.S., or in some cases omission of information because they want to sort of not make this person look as bad as maybe they were. Some of the recent books that I've read, for instance, Jimmy Carter comes off really poorly. Reagan also in some cases comes off as not so great. So sometimes there's an issue there with making political figures seem better or worse than they are. But this is something that I didn't know. Barack Obama was someone very popular. He appeared to be quite pragmatic, although some people think he was quite liberal. I don't think that's quite true. He was a very pragmatic president. And he was a bit of a hawk. He was not afraid to use military force, but in very subtle ways. And in ways that maybe people don't even realize. A lot of secret operations, a lot of drone strikes. For instance, he ordered more drone strikes than any president before or since, and was very decisive and did not hesitate at the moment when it was decided that there's a possibility that Osama bin Laden might be in this compound in Abbottabad. There was a lot of analysis going around, quite a very dangerous mission, and he was very decisive. And so this book covers that. So now here's the thing with this title: is it required reading? And as you guys know, a lot of these videos that we do are sort of focused on the idea of whether a book is required reading or not. This book sort of assumes that you know a lot, and that's why I've probably given you a lot of, relatively speaking, a lot of background, because my feeling is that there's a lot that is assumed. Some people are introduced, but they're introduced in very sort of surface level ways. So you don't really learn a lot about Bush or Clinton or Obama, the presidents. Well, Clinton, Bush, Obama. So that's the order. The presidents who were in power at the time of Al-Qaeda's rise, because it's assumed that you just know who these people are. There is background given, and significant background given, to Osama bin Laden, not as comprehensive as it might be in, say, other books like biographies about Osama bin Laden, and there's quite a lot of them. There's not a lot of background given to Al-Qaeda in general. I mean, there is, but again, there's books that cover this much more deeply. So in many ways, this book kind of assumes you know a lot of stuff already. So because of that, I see this as a book that, if you're interested in his capture and the lead up to finding Osama bin Laden and the killing of Osama bin Laden, then I think this is a great book. I think that you need some background, whether it's watching YouTube videos, whether it's reading other books, that I would say are highly required even before this book. So this book is highly recommended. I think it's a great book if you want to find out how Osama bin Laden was found and ultimately killed, how Al-Qaeda as a terrorist organization was severely weakened during this time period. This is a great book for you. It doesn't give a lot of background on Middle East in general, so you don't learn much about that. Again, it's assumed that you know. You don't learn a lot about the biographies of some of the figures involved. And for that reason, I can't say that it's 100% required. I'd say it's recommended. It's a great book. Another thing to consider is that from this book, there's a great documentary on HBO, also filmed around the time that this book came out, and that gives you a lot of this information and actually features some of these CIA agents, which are really interesting. For instance, there was a large group of women CIA analysts who were really, really instrumental in finding him, but were also very, very marginalized in many ways. This book doesn't cover that quite to the degree that the documentary does. But if you don't watch the documentary and you read this book, kind of keep that in the back of your mind, because I think it's a very interesting aspect of the capture, the eventual locating and elimination of Osama bin Laden. So yeah, I would say this is a very, very good book if you want to learn about the capture and elimination of Osama bin Laden. Gives you some background, but not very much, and it can build your overall base of knowledge of what was going on during that period of time. So thanks again for listening in. The name of the book, once again, is Manhunt, the 10-year search for bin Laden from 9/11 to Abbottabad. by Peter L. Bergen. Check it out. Join us again next week for another episode of Recently Read, and thanks for watching.
If you made it this far, make sure to hit that subscribe button so that you are notified of any upcoming episodes. It's free for you, but it means the world to us.